In a recent story for the Salt Lake Tribune, the reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack exposed this growing climate of unease and fear that has settled among the faculty at Brigham Young University. At the center of all of this is a man named Clark Gilbert. He's the Commissioner of Education for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He oversees BYU and the church's other colleges and seminaries. And this is not just a management role. Gilbert is also a general authority with the church. That's an ecclesiastical position. And part of his calling is to make sure the church's education system lines up with its religious principles. Several months ago now, Peggy discovered that Clark Gilbert had been telling people privately he doesn't think those two areas, academics and doctrine, are perfectly aligned at BYU.
I started working on this story in March when I got a text from a friend who had heard Clark Gilbert give a presentation to a Salt Lake City dinner group. This group included lots of prominent Salt Lake Latter-day Saints, former mission presidents, 70 historians, scholars. And Clark Gilbert gave this presentation talking about BYU and laid out, among other things, these 4 categories of faculty. Those who fully support church doctrine and bring spirituality into the classroom. Those who mostly support but not enough for Mr. Gilbert. Those who have some questions. And the 4th category was, quote, open foes. And according to this tipster who took notes, he said the open foes category, they've got to go. They oppose church leaders, and church leaders do not put up with that. And so we got to get them out. Get them out was the quote that my tipster sent to me. And the person who sent it to me was deeply insulted. And so I started talking to faculty at BYU about this. And, of course, no one wanted to talk about it. And so I thought, well, I'll go in the front door. I'll ask BYU spokesperson Carrie Jenkins. Has he mentioned these categories at BYU? And if so, why? I'll ask the school itself. And she sent back to me the school's mission statement about how it's a religious school and its mission combines spirituality and academics, but did not deny those categories. So I thought, well, okay, that's kind of a non-denial denial. If he, in fact, never said any such thing, I would expect her to say, oh, no, you're misunderstanding, there's miscommunications. And so I told my editor, look, this is a non-denial denial. Can I just write this story? And he's like, no, you have to get this confirmed some other way. And so then I began talking to more and more and more faculty. Eventually, on that point, I discovered somebody who had taken screenshots in a similar presentation at BYU. And I had that person confirm that those were actually the categories that he had laid out. I talked to eventually probably 36 faculty. All these interviews on everything from the loyalty oath to the hiring and firing to the black box, including people who had recently left, but mostly people who were still there. And not one of them would be quoted on the record. I do have quotes from recently retired or recently left faculty that mirror what the current faculty told me. I think it's enough for a story. This is a story about fear. On the one hand, the faculty are afraid to speak up because consequences are real. And on the other hand, they feel demeaned because their judgment isn't trusted. Their judgment about their spirituality, their coursework, their judgment about whom to fire, they do not feel valued or trusted, and they are also afraid.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. So Peggy's story is about fear, about this sense of apprehension among some members of the BYU faculty. But she also explores what a more rigid, orthodox approach could mean for the school's reputation and for the conditions of academic freedom. As she said, she's been working on this story for months, and under the circumstances, it wasn't easy to get people to talk.
I'm a reporter who tries to get people to go on record and can be persuasive. But in this case, I felt that I couldn't push people to go on record when I know what the consequences are of speaking out about any criticisms you have about BYU. So people would tell me these heartbreaking stories. One guy I talked to last spring who was on the record, who had a bad experience with a bishop who threatened to withhold his clearance, that man got another job. And so I thought, oh, good, somebody on the record.
He's free.
But then it turned out that he ended up staying till the end of the school year. And so when I called him back this fall, he said, oh, can you wait till I'm out? So I couldn't use his. So I had some backtracking, some people originally on the record, then off the record. So that was really hard. But then I felt good about the story because I did get some people on the record who had just recently left. One man had his temple recommend. He had opted into the new loyalty oath. His wife was active in the church, but he was denied ability to lead a study abroad, which he had already done once, but the second time, no. And they just told him he wasn't mission fit. It seemed to be an umbrella term for, we're not going to tell you why, but you don't fit, dude. And so he talked to me last spring, and this fall I called him back to make sure he was still on the record, that he actually left. He was in neuropsychology. He left, got a job at Penn, not a bad school. And I said, do you think, is there anything that could have triggered this? And he said, well, I do have 2 queer kids. I might have put a rainbow sticker on something. So he was on the record. So my reporting had to be all of these stories off the record, trying to piece together trends. Would it be fair to say there's a trend? Eventually, I concluded, yes. I've talked to enough people. It's not 3 malcontents. It's not only the humanities department. I talked to people across the campus, so many departments.
Because that is the question you're getting, is whether or not Peggy's just heard from a couple of malcontents who are, overly progressive or woke or whatever the term you want to use.
Yes.
And is this really, in fact, a larger group, possibly the majority? You're saying there's a lot of people. It's, as you said, it's not just the
It's not.
humanities.
I have no numbers. I have no way of knowing numbers. But it isn't just a handful. And it isn't just one department. When you have someone at the law school and someone in the hard sciences and the humanities and the religion department, all of these people emailing me and telling me about their stories and people they thought should be hired that they had put forward as their candidates not getting hired. It's certainly not the majority, but a sizable minority, I would say.
Who's Clark Gilbert? Like, what do we need to know about him to understand where he might be coming from?
Okay, Clark Gilbert was working at Harvard, and he was tapped to become the publisher, I think, of the Deseret News in 2011. And he came in with the idea to disrupt.
He's an acolyte of the prominent Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen, who innovates this idea of disruptive technology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he came in 2011 to Deseret News and instantly laid off 43% of the staff, including 89 people in one day, basically. And his original idea was, well, Mormonism is a volunteer religion. Let's just replace these professional journalists with volunteers. That didn't really work. And then eventually he became president of BYU Idaho. Mm. And then they founded this Pathways project to help kids around the world get college educations. And then he became the Church Commissioner of Education. I think he was made a general authority in 2018. I think he became Church Commissioner of Education in 2021.
Peggy, do we know anything about his politics, his ideology, or his temperament? Like, is he particularly conservative? Is he particularly orthodox, as far as we can tell?
You know, I don't know personally about him, but I do know that part of his agenda seems to be to implement what people would call a conservative or orthodox agenda. I can't say that he's spoken out about politics particularly, but definitely about orthodoxy. Yeah. And what does it mean to be an Orthodox member? I think it's fair to say in that way, culturally conservative. Definitely the church itself is anti-LGBT, anti-same-sex marriage, strong on anti-LGBTQ issues. But the church has given members wiggle room on those issues. It is not part of a temple recommend process. People definitely can support same-sex marriage, and more are, and without consequence in the church at large. But Clark Gilbert has taken that a step further into a zealousness that doesn't exist at the church.
So I was going to ask, like, what in particular is he worried about by, rooting out disloyal members of the faculty? It sounds like it could be said that it's mostly connected to gender and family, and that adds up to professors where they stand on LGBTQ issues. Is that right?
Yes, because he implemented a new, what they are calling an loyalty oath that is in addition to a temple recommend. Like, all BYU professors are expected to have temple recommends. And that's a list of questions about sustaining the leadership, living a, moral life, following the health code, all that stuff. But it never asks about LGBTQ or women or anything like that. This new form that has been implemented it's on top of the recommend and specifically mentions marriage, family, gender. Do you have a, quote, testimony of the church's beliefs, doctrine, policy of marriage, family, and gender? A testimony, not just do you agree not to disagree with them. It's like you're supposed to have a testimony.
Let me read it.
Yeah.
Does this member have a testimony of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and of its doctrine, including its teachings on marriage, family, and gender?
That's right. But it never defines what those are. Clark Gilbert apparently is defining them in the most rigid way. So if you have to have a testimony that marriage is only between one man, one woman, you have to have a testimony of the proclamation on the family that says women are the main nurturers, and gender, that would speak to trans.
Yeah.
So all those culture war issues can be seen in that language. And so many of the people that I talk to faculty have gay children, gay relatives, close relatives. And so they get caught in this place where if I disagree with the church's positions on those issues, to keep my job, I have to lie. If I tell the truth for love of my family, I lose my job. It's just a no-win for some of these. And at what point isn't everyone going to have someone in their lives? Every faculty. Maybe it won't be a child. Maybe it'll be a brother or sister or cousin or somebody close in. And all of a sudden, they're in this dilemma.
One of the issues you raise in the article is whether these standards are kind of arbitrary or capricious. Explain, what is Gilbert's black box?
So the way hiring typically goes is that a candidate gets cleared by their local leaders, religious leaders. They wouldn't even apply if they didn't have that. Then they get interviewed by their department, and then their names are put up the line. So then they go up to a department chair or dean or something, all cleared. Then they have to be interviewed by a general authority. A little unusual for academics, but this has been the way for a long time. And then, and I talked to so many candidates who were told by their general authority, oh, yeah, you're a great candidate. You know, essentially, quote, clearing them. Now, this is coming from the candidate, so the general authority could have said something else. But then at the final is Clark Gilbert's ecclesiastical clearance office. And all these candidates who believed they'd made it through didn't get hired. No reason given. And they would argue, you know, we don't have to give reasons, it's personnel, whatever. But the candidates know this is not an academic rejection. This is a religious rejection, and I don't know what I did wrong. And so many of them desperately want to teach there. They want to know, what did I do wrong? What can I repent of? You know, what can I do better? And that's why it's called the black box, because there's no reason given, and it's clearly a religious rejection, not a scholarly rejection.
There's this interesting kind of conflict or paradox that you bring up in your article. You say that Latter-day Saint leaders are ditching checklists in favor of choice and personal accountability on how to be a righteous member. So on one hand, they're like, all right, we don't need to sort of go down this litany of rules. Like, you guys figure it out. You know what it's like to be righteous, right? But this seems to be going in the opposite direction of that. Is that right?
Yes, that was so stark. That was such a stark contradiction. The LDS Church implemented this new ministering system, which is, I call it do-it-yourself discipleship, and from a previous program that required every month and bring in lesson, whatever. So this new ministering program is not like that. The new for the strength of youth instructions, be modest, but it doesn't tell you don't wear 2 earrings. It's not. It's about principles, not actual checklists. At BYU, this seems to be going the other way. To this is what it means to be a disciple. You do these 10 things. You sign off on the church's positions on marriage, family, and gender, even though, again, it's a black box. I talked to professors who said they were worried about attending someone's same-sex marriage and someone else posting their picture on social media and them being in trouble for attending someone's same-sex marriage. And that's not paranoia because it has happened, but at a level, that is definitely kind of a checklist. And a checklist that you don't know the specifics of.
What are the professors you've been talking to and others, what are they telling you about the consequences of this on the institution itself? I mean, one of the things that you mentioned is it seems to be that there's this choice going on. Should BYU be like Notre Dame, or should it be like Liberty University? I think most people understand the distinction between those two, right? So what are you hearing about that? What do you make of that? What do we understand about what Clark Gilbert may want? Does he want BYU to be, not that it's a binary choice in his mind, but what would he make of that question? Like, what are you hearing about that part?
I think it's pretty clear that Clark Gilbert and the top leaders would like the reputation of a Notre Dame, a Catholic university, yeshiva university. He uses these as examples of how he sees BYU fitting as a religious institution that also is a very well-regarded university. And many of the faculty would love that. But the way you get there, the way those schools have gotten there, is by affirming their religious mission and standards and then giving faculty freedom to pursue it as they see best. And that includes the freedom to sometimes disagree with their church and sometimes do it differently than church leaders would expect. Whereas Liberty University has a very strict code of conduct, a strict set of doctrinal affirmations that they have to sign, and constant sort of monitoring of their professors' publishing to make sure it's all in line. That seems to be the way that this university is going under Clark Gilbert. And the faculty I talked to, I mean, all of them love BYU. These are, I talked to one guy who said, I don't know any open foes. I don't know anyone who's openly writing criticism of the church leaders. That's not happening. These are men and women who love the school, love their faith, and love their students. And they are heartbroken to think that their discipleship is somehow unacceptable.
The rankings from the U.S. News and World Report, which a lot of institutions pay a lot of attention to.
Yes.
You mentioned how the rankings have gone down. Now, whether there's a kind of causal link between all of this and that, who's to say, I suppose? You didn't make that connection. But you do raise the question, what is the impact, and what do you think someone like Clark Gilbert or others are thinking about that part?
You're absolutely right. We cannot say it's because of this or that the rankings go down. Yeah. But definitely BYU administrators do care about those rankings because, again, they want to see themselves in that world, the world of high-ranked religious institutions. They want to be in that category. And so declining rank displeases them. And obviously, I think they're probably trying to figure out, what is it? What is it that has knocked our ranking down? Again, too much of this rigid control of academics, the kinds of academics that some faculty told me, it's a kind of begin with church doctrine and try to work your research to support church doctrine. And that's not really how academic freedom works. So they're worried about that.
It's not supposed to be how science works either, right?
And that's how health science works. It's not how science works. It isn't to say that there isn't some research that does, in fact, support Latter-day Saint doctrine. It absolutely does, but it has to be approached openly. And these faculty are telling me that's not happening.
Let me ask you finally, can a person discern from Clark Gilbert's efforts here, this initiative at sort of weeding out the malcontents or whatever, can we discern a larger concern from higher-ranking church leaders? Because surely it's just not Clark Gilbert who has these concerns about faculty members and their opinions on gender and LGBTQ issues.
I don't have hard information, but I would be shocked if Clark Gilbert was a loose cannon. and that, in fact, the general authorities are not supportive. I think it has to be the case that he is a reflection of some of their concerns at the top. I just honestly don't think he's just doing this on his own. I also think, as we just said, I think there's contradictions even among them. How much should we push? How much should we push back? The church itself has been praised for coming up with compromises on LGBTQ issues. They try to navigate that world in a very careful way. Again, they don't demand that church members oppose same-sex marriage. So there's that thinking, and then there's this thinking. And so I think he's in the middle of these different pushes by general authorities, but I definitely don't think he's acting alone.
Peggy Fletcher Stack, thank you very much.
Love being here.
Peggy Fletcher Stack. She's the senior religion reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune. We'll put a link to her article on our website, RadioWest.org. We reached out to Brigham Young University for a comment. They sent us a statement similar to the one they offered Peggy. We'll put a copy of that on our website. Among other things, it pointed out that applications and enrollment at the university continue to increase, that more than 90% of the faculty at BYU anonymously reported they were satisfied or very satisfied with their jobs, according to a third-party survey, and that the overwhelming majority of employees are cleared for employment. We should also say we invited Clark Gilbert to join us. We haven't heard back yet. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're discussing an article in the Salt Lake Tribune about what seems to be the growing tension at Brigham Young University under the leadership of a man named Clark Gilbert. He's the LDS Church's education commissioner. Gilbert has tightened the rules around faculty conformity. He's imposed what the article says is a loyalty oath, where professors are expected to state their allegiance to the church's doctrines on marriage and family and gender. The reporter Peggy Fletcher Stack talked with Taylor Petrey for the article. He's a scholar of religion. And he told her that some in the BYU faculty are confused about these guidelines because church doctrine isn't as fixed as leaders might think it is. Petrey told us there's a lot going on in this story.
I think that what the episode at BYU illustrates are long-standing tensions, frictions within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, conflicts between faith and reason, conflicts over inclusion and exclusion, conflicts between church leaders and intellectuals. And all of these things are kind of set in the broader context of what's happening in America right now, of a really deep conflict over higher education, as a polarized environment has really turned conservatives against professors, against universities. And I think all of these things are kind of feeding into each other in this sort of tinderbox moment right now where tensions are extremely high and accusations are extremely fierce right now on sort of all sides of this issue.
So here's a question that some have been asking since the article came out. Why shouldn't the standard for those who teach in the church's educational system be a different standard than for rank-and-file members? I mean, the wording in the contract does mention how the potential teacher will be an influence on youth and young adults. So what about it?
I think every BYU faculty member, and I've spoken to BYU faculty members current, some retired, some who were directly blocked by Gilbert, and I heard their stories. Every single BYU faculty member or person who's a prospective faculty member completely agrees that BYU should have a high expectation for BYU faculty. I think that one of the disingenuous features of the way that this has kind of been debated in the public is that BYU faculty or prospective BYU faculty are arguing for their right to undermine people's faith, or they're arguing that they should be able to say that they don't believe in the proclamation. They all agree that there should be high standards. they ultimately believe that the standards that are being imposed on them are opaque, they are arbitrary, they are, in some cases, vindictive, that they are prejudicial against certain kinds of people or the kinds of research that people might do. And again, having known many of the people who have been directly affected and spoken to them and heard their stories, the idea that these people are not worthy to teach at BYU or somehow insufficiently loyal to the church is really outrageous. I know, again, many of these people, and I know their stories, and they don't know why they've been excluded. And so it's this kind of sole authoritarian control that's being exercised here to define who is worthy to teach at BYU that has so many people concerned.
You were quoted in the Salt Lake Tribune article as saying that the guidelines about what is and what isn't church doctrine, those guidelines can be ambiguous. And here's what you said in the piece. You said what Clark Gilbert and some church leaders think is fixed and unquestionable church doctrine is not what others think. Say more. And maybe I can be specific. Is the support of the principle of same-sex marriage, is the support of transgender people who transition, like support of that, believing that they have that legal right, where does that fit in the sense of fixed and not fixed doctrine?
Church leaders themselves have changed their interpretations of the proclamation on the family, for instance, one of the kind of central issues of concern. There are other concerns about feminism and other concerns about teaching religious studies in ways that Gilbert specifically finds objectionable. So there are some other issues that are coming up here. But I think that many faculty members think that he has confused his personal opinions about these issues with church doctrines. And so, for instance, is wearing a rainbow pin or posting a rainbow emoji in support of your queer children something that should be disqualifying to teach at BYU? Many people believe that Elder Gilbert thinks that, yes, that is the case, while most, I think, members would say, no, that's not the case. I think that there are other issues around trans issues. The church itself has changed its teachings on trans people 3 times in the last 6 years. And so to say that there is some absolutely clear doctrine that must be followed here when the church itself is sort of muddling around in this issue, I think is another area where BYU professors feel like they're being left out in the cold if they're taking a position on something that 2 years ago, the church said was perfectly fine to take hormones, and now they're saying you can't do hormones anymore, right? So there's so much kind of shifting sand underneath so many of these issues, and to treat them as if they are crystal clear is really a disservice to so many of the faculty members who are affected by this. And again, we're not talking about the outer limits. We're not talking about people who are, saying publicly that they think that LGBT people should be able to be sealed in the temple. That's not what's happening here. And that's not the case of anybody that I know that has been affected by these policies. And again, in fact, it's not clear. I asked them to point to, well, what do you think it might be? And they sit in silence. They say, I can't think of anything that I would have said that fit into this category that even came close to it. And those who are affected by this call this a kind of spiritual abuse because they're led to rack their brains to find, what have I done? What have I said? What was the thing that I did that crossed some line somewhere? Again, this is not that they can't go to their stake president and bishop and ask, because their stake president and bishop say, we have no problem with you. We're not the ones who have put any limitations here. And so they're really left out in the cold to wonder what it is that they're doing, and that it seems to be that Elder Gilbert is the accusation, at least that I'm hearing, the Elder Gilbert is applying his own personal standards, which may or may not reflect the broadly held understanding of what church teachings actually are and what BYU professors should be saying publicly.
Professor, what do you know about and what do you understand about Clark Gilbert's philosophy, business philosophy, as that, and how it connects to his own sort of moral standard? He was closely connected to Clayton Christensen. He was one of Clayton Christensen's students at Harvard Business School. Christensen is, as some people may know, is known for pioneering this concept of disruptive innovation in business. He was a disruptor. And there was an era not so long ago when there was a lot of talk about disruption as a sort of business technique. Gilbert seemed to absolutely go along with that. And in fact, in the Salt Lake Tribune article, Peggy Fletcher Stack mentions that he laid off 43% of the staff at Deseret News as a way of sort of disrupting that, media system. What do we know about where his sort of business philosophy or ideology connects with the religious part? Do they align in any way, the way he thinks about the world?
They absolutely do, and I think this is such an important insight where the disruption business strategy that is so often touted by many of these figures has been used to understand a kind of overturning of markets to kind of do things in completely different ways. And there's a lot of business wisdom in that, and there's a good reason why those ideas have had such praise and popularity in the business world. And when he goes to the Deseret News and slashes a bunch of writers and so on there, it is done on the basis of a business model to make it profitable again, right? I think that one of the big differences in bringing the disruptive model to the university is it's not the case that BYU is not competing in the marketplace or that it is that is in need of a kind of economic rejuvenation or something along those lines. Rather, there's an ideological disruption that he's seeking to implement. And this is where I think the disruption theory is a little bit more dangerous when it comes to installing what amounts to what many BYU faculty and others have described as a purity campaign. The way that purity campaigns operate is by finding a set of internal people to the organization who are seen as unworthy, who are seen as bad, who are seen as the problem, and then excluding them. This is what every witch hunt in history has ever been based on. It's what the Inquisition was based on. And again, it's possible to say, yeah, we shouldn't have witches in our city, and we shouldn't have, heretics in our midst here, right? And we should be free from from having to deal with those people, and they shouldn't have influence on our children around us, right? And the thing is, you always find witches. You always find heretics, not because there actually are witches and heretics, but because the purity campaign requires it, right? It's built on the philosophy that there are impurities that need to be excluded. And that's really where this sort of disruption as an ideological project of kind of going after the people that he thinks, again, as much as 30% of the faculty that he thinks are not worthy to be at BYU. And then you say he fired 43% of the staff at the Deseret News. It has people shaking in their boots, even if it's not actually happening and we aren't seeing firings. We're seeing a lot of pressure campaigns on individuals. And again, taking control over the hiring process is sort of these early steps. But it's why people are so frustrated and so scared, really, of what might be coming next as he's instituting these kinds of personal arbitrary standards on the faculty to say who is and who is not worthy.
Taylor Petrey, he's an associate professor of religion at Kalamazoo College. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're talking about what appears to be an effort to reform or realign the loyalty of the professors at Brigham Young University. Back now to our conversation with the scholar of religion, Taylor Petrey. One of the things that Gilbert has been critical of is what he describes as the decoupling of faculty hiring from the religious mission of the university. And he wrote this piece a while back for the Deseret magazine. And in it, he writes about what he describes as Harvard University's path to secularization. He went to Harvard, and he mentioned how Harvard's initial focus, he said, was decidedly religious. Now, this was a long time ago. But he mentioned how over time the school changed its focus. And it didn't necessarily, at least initially, ditch, the faith part. But it started to transform the faith part, to see it differently, to refocus it. And so in the late 1800s, Harvard, he said, embraced this philosophy that the way to serve Christ in the church was not through the founding ideal of knowing God, but rather through cultivating open inquiry. Now, he clearly sees that as a mistake. Gilbert says that's the decoupling, a decoupling of spiritual learning from secular inquiry. And I guess that's what he wants to avoid. Is he seeing that at BYU, that decoupling that he wants to, I don't know what, reconnect?
So I was at Harvard at much of the same time that Elder Gilbert was at Harvard. We didn't know each other then. And I think that for many who were at Harvard at the same time and read that story that he tells about Harvard, it's a frustrating one. It's one that doesn't really seem to accurately represent the history or the present of Harvard. And I'll give one example of it, which is that he says he begins the story by saying that he walked out of the Memorial Church in Harvard Yard. This is the church that is in the center of Harvard Yard, where it is still operating to this day as a church. There are chaplains who are employed by Harvard University who work there. They work with different faith groups. They have preaching there. I have preached in that chapel several times myself. There is a divinity school at Harvard 3 blocks away, where people are still trained to be ministers and chaplains and pastors in their traditions. And that's where I went. It's where Elder Holland's son teaches today. The idea that Harvard is a secular, hellscape is not at all representative of the way that many people, including myself, experienced it there. So I think a lot of people see that he has really kind of a mistaken assessment of the role of secularism and the role of faith in universities. It's one that sees secularism as something which, as you said, as the enemy of faith, rather than as something which has often, in some cases, corrected the problems of faith. Religion in the 1800s and in the 1700s wasn't a particularly great place for women. It wasn't a particularly great place for people of color, right? And those corrections that have been made over time have often been made because of secular critiques to religion. And so this idea that religion needs to dominate and that it needs to be have exclusive control and sort of put secularism in its place is one which I think tells a really mistaken history of the role that religion and secularism have played in society.
So how much of this is, or seems to be, I guess, revealing of a church that may be trying to lean a little bit further to the right, or at least responding to the kind of, I'll put it this way, MAGA moment? Is there a connection there?
I think it's difficult to say that there isn't. Conservative Latter-day Saints who belong to the broader conservative American movement right now are suspicious of BYU. And it doesn't help that church leaders are saying you have every right to be suspicious of BYU, that there are all these rotten apples at BYU. And so there absolutely is this era where we're seeing a real turn against higher education, a real turn against practices of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Gender studies have been a big target for many on the right, not just at BYU, but far beyond its borders and even in state schools that are trying to undermine these kinds of programs. And I think that the church kind of belongs to that zeitgeist a little bit, that it too is turning away against higher education. And one way that they're trying to kind of reassure its membership, its very conservative membership, that BYU is a safe place to send their conservative students and that they're still going to come out nice conservative kids at the end, is by demonstrating this sort of performative cleaning of the house.
This came up in I'm guessing this came up in the conversations that Peggy Fletcher Stack was having with some of those faculty members who didn't want to go on the record, that it seemed like there was a choice between whether or not Brigham Young University would end up being more akin to Notre Dame or Liberty University, deeply sort of conservative evangelical Christian university. I'm not sure if you know, but what's your sense of what Clark Gilbert wants? Does he want BYU to be Liberty or Notre Dame?
Well, if you look at what Elder Holland said, he's saying we're willing to be Liberty University if that's what it means to stay close to who we are, right? And so I think that's essentially, that's obviously my interpretation of it. But when you say we're willing to give it all up, we're willing to give up all the prestige that we have built over the last century in order to stay close to our principles, they absolutely seem to be signaling that that's the direction that they're headed. Religious universities tend to fall between a set of extremes of, sort of loosely held principles that everybody kind of signs on to. And, you shouldn't rock the boat too much, but there's going to be a wide variety of beliefs and practices among the faculty, and others that are much more restrictive in sort of the thought police realm, and where I think BYU faculty are worried about is that they're headed in that thought police direction, which they've always been to a certain extent, but even further. And they see that as really dangerous territory where it risks the reputation that they have tried to build themselves, that they have worked hard as professional academics in the broader field to say, BYU is a great place and we're doing good work, and you can trust the stuff that comes out of here as we're good scholars and we're trying to assimilate and trying to be a part of the larger world. And they see that really as at risk here by heading in the direction of a fundamentalist university like Liberty.
Is there any reason to believe that this new contract and these new ideas and changes instituted by Clark Gilbert will be any more enduring than any of the other moments in the church's or BYU's past? The article mentions Ernest Wilkinson. He was a BYU professor who, along with some of the more kind of conservative and doctrinaire members of the church hierarchy, really changed the process of hiring to sort of more align with their more orthodox ideas. Is there any reason but that went away, sort of transformed and changed. Any reason to believe this one won't either? They all seem to evolve and change over time. Any reason to think this would be any different, I guess?
I think everybody acknowledges that we are in a pendulum swing to the right in with these changes, and that the pendulum will swing back again. Absolutely. And how long will it last? How deeply felt will be the long-term consequences here? It's too early to say. We're really just in the last 2 or 3 years of this. And so, what does it look like in 10 years, I think, will be the real test of things. Or will there be another correction coming soon? There's so much discontent, so much dissatisfaction with the leadership, such a breakdown in respect that I wouldn't be surprised if we did see some changes again in the next couple of years and some attempts to kind of correct back again. But that's definitely, as a historian, that's the nature of things, is that they move one direction and then they move the other again. How long it will be is too hard to say.
Let me ask you one final question. It's something you mentioned to us. I'm not sure how much you want to say about this, but it's a kind of ironic twist to the story. You said to us that in some ways that all of this negative publicity about Brigham Young University and these changes that are going on down there could actually make it worse. Do you mind saying something about that?
I spoke to some BYU faculty who expressed some reservations about the media coverage of this topic because they worried that it would get worse. In part, they worry, and I think others do as well, that the negative attention that they get from the media, from liberals, from people outside of BYU is all just vindication that they're doing something right. And the worry is that then there are going to be further and further crackdowns as they in their quest for purity, in their quest to expel those people who are insufficiently loyal or who have, expressed some criticisms of the new hiring policies, that's the kind of thing that can now maybe seriously impede your career going forward, right? So there's definitely a worry that there's a kind of, potential for revenge. It's why so many faculty refuse to go on the record. It's why they are, very careful about what they say, because even, again, very minor complaints about things like hiring policies can suddenly be a thing that really jeopardizes your whole career. And so they're very afraid in a way that has undermined their hopes, their desires, their trust that BYU has a strong future, and they're starting to question that.
Professor Petrey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Taylor Petrey. He's an associate professor of religion at Kalamazoo College. We'll put a link to the Tribune story on our website, RadioWest.org. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1 and Instagram at Radio West. You can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. The program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.